Okay, thank you. Thank you for everybody who's joined us and for everybody that's watching on Facebook. This is the latest session on ADC's 9/11 virtual symposium, taking a look at different areas of our life that have been affected after 9/11, different areas of policy. And today we're going to be discussing an important topic with three experts on the issue of immigration. Just from a standpoint for the Arab American community, I think for all minority communities, one of the main areas after 9/11, which really saw a significant impact, a significant targeting, was immigration. From the immediate aftermath with programs like USCIS taking us all the way through the era of the Muslim ban and what we're seeing now, it's all connected. The actions of Donald Trump and the actions we were seeing and the targeting we're seeing of immigrant communities, of the refugee crisis, and so forth, and the attack on refugees in this country did not start in the past 4 years or 5 years when Trump came on stage. This is all connected, and some of these policies and practices can be traced back to 9/11. So joining us today is a great panel, and I'm proud to call these individuals friends and mentors as well, folks who've helped me throughout my career, and folks who are good friends of the community and of ADC. I'm just going to mention just a few lines from their bios. Those have been emailed to everybody participating. Then we're going to get into a conversation about the issues. Each panelist will have an opportunity to answer a question that'll get us going. And then if you're watching through the webinar, there's a Q&A box at the bottom, or a chat box. You can post your questions. If you're watching the live stream on Facebook, you can post a question and that'll get sent to us as well. But joining us today is Shoba Wadhia, who's the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Samuel Weiss Faculty Scholar and Clinical Professor of Law at Penn State Law in University Park. Her research focuses on the role of prosecution discretion in immigration law and the intersections of race, national security, and immigration. And Shoba has been an expert and somebody that's lent their time to ADC in the community for many years, and we're going to dive into that. Also with us is Denyse Sabagh, who's an attorney at Duane Morris and has more than 30 years experience representing diverse clients in the areas of immigration and nationality law and litigation. She's also an ADC national board member, part of the ADC legal committee, and somebody who the organization has leaned on for years for guidance, for expertise. And me personally, for a number of years now since coming to DC, she's provided excellent advice on a number of issues and cases we've worked on. And we also have with us, lucky to have with us, Sirine, who's the Executive Director of the National Immigration She's a longtime immigrant rights advocate who focuses on combining litigation and public campaign strategies to defend and advance the rights of immigrant communities of color. Sirine has put in tremendous work for the community. We got to know each other really well over the past few years, working alongside Shoba and Denyse when it comes to the Muslim ban, the No Ban Act, and everything else we saw under the Trump administration that we're trying to forget and recover from, but it's still there. So we'll get into that conversation a little bit. But I want to start, with Shoba to discuss some of these post 9/11 policies, such as USCIS and others, and the impact they've had today and what lessons we learned post 9/11. So thank you.
Thanks, Abed. It's great to be here. I'm really honored to also be on a panel with people who I also call friends and who've been in the trenches, sometimes alongside with them since 9/11. So when we hear the word post 9/11 and post 9/11 policies, at least in the immigration space, we're talking specifically about policies that were designed with a national security label or with the proxy of national security, but ultimately was an immigration enforcement tool targeting specific communities, in this case, Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities. And really to set the stage, I wanted to go back to a quote that the former Attorney General, John Ashcroft, made after 9/11. And I think it really puts a fine tooth on how immigration policy and national security were connected after 9/11, and how immigrants and terrorists were, in many cases, conflated. He said, "Let the terrorists among us be warned. If you overstay your visa, even by 1 day, we will arrest you. If you violate a local law, you will be put in jail and kept in custody as long as possible. We will use every available statute. We will seek every prosecutorial advantage. We will use all our weapons within the law and under the Constitution to protect life and enhance security for America." So you also see here a sort of separation between security and liberty in the United States and those who even overstay 1 day on their visa, or who may have some type of immigration violation. I'm going to identify 3 policies, and I know we'll dig a little more in the Q&A. And I first want to talk about just the days after 9/11. There were roughly 1,200 men from largely Masa countries who were swept up in what a lot of press and lawyers called a roundup. And the conditions under which these men were held was documented in an Inspector General report by then Inspector General Glenn Fine. He looked at conditions of September 11th detainees at 2 facilities, the Metropolitan Detention Center and Passaic County Jail. And this idea of labeling somebody as a September 11th detainee was quite broad. In fact, there were detainees who had routine civil immigration violations as opposed to actual acts of terrorism. Fine found that at the Metropolitan Detention Center, there were detainees that were held under lockdown for 23 hours a day. They were placed in 4-man holds. They couldn't talk to their lawyers or to their family. And they also were not consistently given basic requirements of process, like the notice of why they were being held in the first place. So the conditions that September 11th detainees were held under was not just the limit, right? There was a second memo or policy known as the Creppy Memo. This permitted immigration courts to conduct secret hearings for special interest cases. And what this means is that immigration hearings could be closed to the public, to the media, to the press. The immigration courts are part of the Department of Justice. So when a non-citizen is placed in removal proceedings, they go before an immigration judge who hears charges against them and also any application for relief. It was documented that more than 600 immigration cases were closed because of the Creppy Memo. And the courts were really split on whether the memo violated the US Constitution. The final policy I'll mention is NSEERS, which Abed mentioned too, also called Special Registration, and technically the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. This was a system that enlisted certain people to register with the federal government and to go through questions, photographs, fingerprints. It was a program that was really rolled out in stages through a publication in a document called the Federal Register. But the most visible and controversial part of NSEERS happened right here in the United States. It was a domestic component, if you will, where over 80,000 men from largely Muslim majority countries over the age of 16 went to local immigration offices for special registration. It was an experiment that was ultimately discredited, and which what the Department of Homeland Security's own watchdog found was ineffective. But before all that happened, more than 13,000 men were served with deportation papers after complying with the special registration program. So there was no national security value, but it did result in significant immigration consequences. So some of the lessons from the policies I just mentioned, which are really just the tip of the iceberg, are ones that connect to lessons that we could talk about in light of the most recent policies of the administration. One might be the sort of power of executive overreach and the power of the executive generally, right? So we could have a broader conversation about what the limits or power of the executive should look like and how they affect people and the rule of law. A second lesson is to think about how courts are not necessarily the place that are going to save us from discriminatory policies. In order to bring a selective prosecution claim, for example, it's a very high standard. It's very challenging to have a successful legal challenge, and NSEERS is a good example of that. Dozens of cases were brought in the courts challenging NSEERS on constitutional grounds, but under a doctrine known as the plenary power doctrine, most courts were deferential to the executive branch of government and also followed or applied this all too high selective prosecution standard. So we really need to think about what the limits and opportunities of the courts look like. And then a final lesson, and one that we can really trace all the way to the events of last week, is just the lasting effects. We can end a policy, we can end an era, we can end a war, right? But there are lasting effects that can range from trauma to the inability to get a green card or US citizenship that continue and permeate even with the end of a policy. So I'll end there and look forward to hearing from Denyse and Sirine.
Thank you, Shoba, and appreciate it. Denyse, just to carry on what Shoba was saying, you were involved with ADC, you're a member of the community, and you're also a private practitioner as well. What are some of the direct impacts, 9/11 had on our community members, some of your clients, and some of the lasting impacts that it's had and what you've seen through your experiences?
Thank you, Abed. And it's great to be here with everybody, and especially with such an esteemed panel. I do want to say that just to give you some context, ADC was really incredible on the post 9/11 era. They really were in overdrive. They had a fairly young legal team, but that team went into action, and that team represented our community in the most amazing way. They were advocates at all the government agencies and also with the FBI, who the Arab community really and Muslim community really did not have a relationship with before 9/11. And after 9/11, it became clear to our community, and interestingly enough to the FBI, that there needed to be some connection. And ADC was one of the leaders in establishing that connection and also really fighting for the rights of the community. It was because of a lot of that work that people's lives and cases were affected in a positive way. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that. Shoba gave a really good foundation about what happened after 9/11, and what was really telling and just searing about it was how rapid fire things changed. Things changed so fast that the lawyers really didn't know what was going on. The legal foundation of what we thought we knew the law to be was changing. There were Shoba talked about these closed hearings. That wasn't even publicized. It was only because all of a sudden your case was no longer on the docket. We've had hearings, where the case all of a sudden disappeared, and we would call the immigration clerk at the courthouse, and they would say, well, we can't talk to you about the case. And we go, well, why is that? And they said, we just can't talk to you. You can come in and we'll talk to you when you come in about the case, but we can't talk to you about the case. So what we saw in terms of the immigration courts was that it was very difficult to get information. It was almost impossible to have a conversation with the trial attorney, which was something you usually could have in a normal setting. With regard to bonds, bonds were almost completely unavailable. So if your client, had really no criminal convictions, no issues except for an immigration violation, small immigration violation, trying to get a bond for that person was really difficult. And I mean, we had on some of the cases, we had like a 3-day bond hearing, which was unheard of at the time. And in terms of trying to work out any sort of settlements with the trial attorneys, that was pretty much out of the question. So that was with regard to the immigration courts. And I'm going to go through the various types of applications so that you could see what's happened after 9/11 and since. So also with the U.S. immigration, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, well, it had been Immigration and Naturalization Services. But then after 9/11, the Homeland Security Act of 2002 was implemented, and they created the Department of Homeland Security. So they rolled in to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection into that agency. So, and it was disorganized, and the whole focus was national security or the guise of national security. Oh, many, many things were happening, but it wasn't really national security. So let's take adjudications. This is when you're applying for your green card, or you're applying for naturalization, or you're applying for a work authorization document, or you're applying for a non-immigrant visa. Well, after 9/11, what we saw was delays, meant like pretextual denials where you would be scratching your head and would go, how could this be? They basically, the Immigration Service was looking at cases with a fine-tooth comb. And we did not know this at the time, but there was a secret program called Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, CARP, which basically excluded many applicants from Arab and Middle Eastern and Muslim and South Asian communities from benefits by delaying the opportunities or denying their applications without legal authority. So what we would see would be, or you get a request for additional information. And that request for additional information would ask for the most innocuous things, or it would be in huge detail. And you go, well, where is this coming from? Well, basically, it was coming from this program where the FBI was actually involved in the immigration process. The Immigration Service could reach out, or the FBI could reach out to them and ask for different information that they would then ask the Immigration Service to ask your client. So you would be in, say, an interview for a green card, and all of a sudden, there might be another person there that, you were not sure who they were. They never identified themselves. They would just be there. You would ask who they were. And then you get a plethora of questions that had nothing to do with the particular application. So if it's a naturalization application, there's certain things you have to prove. You answer those questions, but then you got a lot of questions about, well, do you know this person? Did you know that person? Do you know these names? Where were you? What countries have you been in? Talk about, what mosque you go to, many, many questions that were not even on the application. And it took us a while to try to figure this out, that this program was in place, but the ACLU actually found it under one of their Freedom of Information Act requests, and then was able to publish a wonderful, marvelous piece of work about it that explained it. But up until that time, it was really unclear why your naturalization application was taking so long, why your green card application was taking so long. And then with regard to asylum applications, they were like kind of 86. I mean, they were there, but you were not getting responses. And even up till today, with many of the applicants from, the Middle Eastern countries and Muslim countries, those applications languish. They'll sit there for years before they are adjudicated. And that goes to this, what they started to call a deconfliction process. I had never heard that term before, but basically it's when the government agency, i.e. if it's the FBI, is the owner, quote unquote, of the information that's holding the case up, somehow, clears that information. And so once that information clears, and if the case is approvable, they'll approve it. If not, it languishes. With regard, and then for people with asylum claims, a lot of times it's really, really important to have those claims adjudicated timely, not 6 years later, but timely. And then you had ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Well, they were like, the handcuffs were off and they were out there gangbusters, trying to round up clients and put them in jail and not give them any bond. And usually you have been able to talk to the ICE officers and say, look, they have strong family unit, they have a job, they haven't had any issues, no criminal violations, but that didn't seem to matter. And then with regard to the FBI, this was my typical day. I would get a call, saying my father was arrested, or a call saying that my brother just got picked up from immigration, or, an email saying that somebody can't get into the country or they just got turned away. That was the effect on the community after 9/11. And even today, with regard to the lasting effects, it's still today with regard to adjudications, with regard to asylum applications, consular processing. I know Abed and ADC get calls upon calls about people whose visas were all of a sudden revoked, or they can't get a visa after they had been getting visas for many years with no information whatsoever. And on the consular processing, there's a term called administrative processing. And so if your case is stuck at a US embassy, they say it's an administrative processing. Well, administrative processing is like a black hole. It is opaque. You can't get through to it. And you can do everything you can to try to explain, to try to help them help you. And it's pretty much falling on deaf ears. But even today, these things are going on. So in terms of the 9/11, its immediate effect and then its long-term effect, it is still there. It may not be as severe in the sense of with the huge numbers, but it is still there and it's still with us. And what we have done is we file a lot of mandamus applications to get the government to do their job. And if those mandamus applications, usually what happens is you file it, and a mandamus action is a lawsuit against the government that basically says to the judge, tell them to do their job. They are required to give you a decision, whether it's a yes or a no, they are required to give you a decision. So let me just stop there. And I know we'll have questions in the chat.
Thank you, Denyse. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn to Sirine. Denyse mentioned that we're still seeing uh, a lot of the issues, the administrative processing, the delays, the ban that we've talked about, that we've worked on. But from your experiences and from your work, what's the connection between what we're seeing today? Is it as egregious? Are we seeing different forms of challenges, and what we witnessed immediately after 9/11?
Yeah, thank you, Abed, and thanks, Shoba and Denyse, for these wonderful presentations as well. I think maybe the way to sort of start on this is to say that just as 9/11 was a catalyst for all kinds of really damaging, disturbing policies that were applied against the Arab and Muslim communities, it also was not the first time in history, right, that immigration enforcement was used in this awful way, and that the FBI was surveilling people who were kind of considered to be from undesirable communities. As I was starting to speak, I noticed this comment in the chat box about the surveillance of Black activists by the FBI, and also Black Muslims and others who have sort of experienced the intersection of the criminal justice, the immigration, and the kind of surveillance systems within which we operate. And so I did want to sort of like mention that as I start talking about the Muslim ban and how that kind of grew out of the post 9/11 policies, that there is definitely a long history of this country's immigration laws targeting one group of people after another and doing it in a way that's extremely nefarious. Of course, what happened after 9/11 was extremely aggravated in a way that we're still seeing today. And in some ways, it actually set the stage for more surveillance and more targeting and more kind of terrible measures being taken against other communities too. Like, it started with the Arab and Muslim community, and now we're seeing kind of massive surveillance of other communities through all these kind of private companies and kind of technologies that have expanded the scope of that surveillance. So maybe a way to kind of situate my intervention is actually to talk about it too as situated within that history. And for those of you not familiar, I am Arab American, and I love ADC and I love Abed. But also I'm the executive director of the National Immigration Project, as Abed mentioned, and our organization is a membership organization that counts as some of its members, both Denyse and Shoba, so that's wonderful. But so our focus has always been on criminalization issues and enforcement issues, and the ways in which immigration is also a racial justice issue. And this, the 9/11 and post 9/11 measures and the ongoing kind of experiences of Arab and Muslim immigrants in the United States are very much something that falls at the nexus of that. Before, I think Denyse talked about the administrative processing and the endless delays and the CARP program. I'll just add to that a couple of other things. Before the Muslim ban ever came down, Yemeni people in particular were experiencing really, really disturbing delays in getting passports issued even if they were US citizens, because of ostensible security concerns and fraud concerns. And so that community was being targeted in ways that wasn't just kind of the administrative processing issues and the immigration issues, but even if you had a claim to US citizenship or you were a US citizen, in many instances, people couldn't get passports issues. And that's something that I'm still hearing about. I'm not sure, I'm curious to know, Abed and Denyse especially, but also Shoba, if you're kind of hearing about this still, but we're certainly seeing still continuing instances of that. Before the Muslim ban came down, and this is one way in which it was particularly harsh on the Yemeni community, there were many, many Yemenis who were stuck in Djibouti and in other third countries waiting for their visas to come through because they couldn't go back to Yemen, and they were ostensibly had approved immigrant visas to come to the US, and then they would get stuck in this black hole of administrative processing. And that is definitely something that is still happening to this day. And then on top of all of that, after 9/11, there was also these moves to surveil Arab and Muslim people within the United States. And so like Arab students, for example, would later find out that they had been surveilled by all kinds, not just by the federal government, but also, for example, by the NYPD, which was surveilling Arab and Muslim students in New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And I happened to be an Arab student at that time in New York. So like that, I think those things kind of reached very far and set up a system where there is ongoing surveillance now that has been reported, in various contexts of people who frequent certain mosques or who live in who come from certain countries. And that's something that has definitely not stopped. So all of these things were happening before the Muslim, like in between kind of 9/11 and the Muslim ban. And then of course, there was this act of Congress in 2015 that took certain people out of the visa waiver program. So like if you're from certain EU countries or kind of a broad range of countries that have agreements with the United States, you can actually come to the US without applying for a visa in advance and going through kind of a weeks or months long process to get that stamp so that you can come here. But then they accepted from that program people from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and also North Korea. But so that those countries became the ones that were listed in the first and original Muslim ban. And so again, it's kind of like multiple instances of precedents that are targeting people from certain countries to make it harder for them to come here, and then to make it harder for them when they're applying for benefits here to actually obtain these benefits. The CARP program that Denyse alluded to caused intense delays and continues to cause intense delays for people who are trying to adjust their status. And there's obviously intensive litigation about that. But to me, that's not something that has fallen away. And then the Muslim ban kind of picks up on all of that pre-existing apparatus, and then makes it kind of its most extreme manifestation of actually actively banning everybody from those countries from coming to the United States. And then because of litigation, you kind of get these successive kind of softening a little bit of the scope of the ban to not include lawful permanent residents, for example, or to not include to not be retroactive, to not include people who are literally mid-flight, which is kind of how the first Muslim ban played out, which is why you saw all the kind of, the movements at the airport that that ended up happening. But then that kind of got moved to consulates abroad, where people from many, many countries could not even apply to come to the United States, or if they did apply, they had to go through this waiver process that was not really a meaningful process. And it kind of resulted in not just the mechanics of not allowing people to come to the United States, but also the message to those communities that they don't belong here, that we don't belong here, that, our communities are not equal to other communities in the United States. And that's a very damaging message to send if you're like a Syrian or Iranian kid who's growing up in the US, who's suddenly asking like, why can't my uncle come to visit? Or why can't my grandparents come to visit? And you're being told that your government is saying that you're banned because of where you come from. And that, I think, despite the fact that in the aftermath of the Biden administration coming to power, the Muslim ban was officially rescinded, there are many, many people who missed like births of their grandkids and marriages and funerals and all kinds of things because of their inability to come here. And many people who actually missed the ability to go home to visit their family and come back because they were worried that they wouldn't be able to come back, for example, if they're pursuing a course of study or something of that nature and already in the United States. And I also, I think that it remains to be seen. And again, I'd be curious to hear, from the other panelists and from Abed about what you're seeing. Like, it remains to be seen how all those people who had been in the pipeline for immigrant visas, for example, and who were cut off by the Muslim ban, like, are they really going to be made whole? What is to me, there's still kind of unclarities about how that process is going to go. And I think that, the damage has kind of far exceeded just the actual specifics or technicalities of like who is actually banned. I think it kind of swept much more broadly. But so anyway, I don't want to go on too long because I know we want to leave time for Q&A, but I will just say, like, to this day, administrative processing, I think, is still very much like a reality that people who apply to come here in any kind of form from any of these, those countries, are likely to face. And in the extreme cases, it can be years, and in some of the other cases, it can be months, but still it's very damaging. Surveillance is still something that is experienced by a lot of people from these communities and from other communities now in different forms and in different iterations. FBI interventions and like attempts to get people to become informants, and surveillance of mosques and surveillance of other places where people from Arab and Muslim communities gather. I think that's something that, again, is not something that we've seen the end of. And broadly, I think the immigration system has become one that is focused on shutting people out and focused on detention and focused on enforcement in a way that has really been damaging, not just to the Arab community, but to all communities of immigrants. And that's something that I think, the Biden administration has not done enough to really kind of step away from and disavow. And so to me, I think that is going to be a very important thing to watch, to see how the administration relates to that landscape.
Thank you, Sirine. And just to answer your question, I mean, from our perspective, there's still, from our experiences and the cases we're getting, there are people that are still dealing with the ramifications of the Muslim ban. Not everybody has been made whole again. Folks are still in the pipelines, and frankly, we still have a few clients that are still dealing with the fallout of NCIRS, which is much older than the Muslim ban. So we're definitely still seeing these lingering issues, administrative processing, the asylum delays. Just last week, I was on the phone complaining to Denyse about cases from 2014, 2013 that are still, asylum cases that are still being delayed. So we are definitely still seeing those issues. I don't know, Denyse or Shoba, if you want to jump in on that and what you're seeing or hearing on your end.
Well, I mean, they're not as many, but there still are delays. And whether it's asylum delays, whether it's green cards delays, whether it's naturalization delays, there still are delays. And that's, I mean, just in the last couple of years, we've probably brought quite a few mandamus cases to get those cases moving. But, and you can, a lot of people, I mean, they do what they need to do. They contact their congressman or senator to see if they can help move their cases. Congressmen and senators, at least under the Trump administration, got pretty much nothing. Under this administration, it's still, the jury's still out, but it's pretty much so far the same. It's being processed, or we're looking at it, we're reviewing it. You would use the USCIS ombudsman's office. They try to help when they can, but a lot of times that's not successful. And I think it's basically the CART program at work without us knowing it.
Right.
And maybe I would just add, just to put kind of a human example of what some of these lasting effects look like beyond the delays, which are striking. If you have a family or a spouse who has spouses that have been separated from each other for 3 years because of the Muslim ban, even their reunification doesn't make everything okay again, right? So there's still a lingering effect from that separation that has to be addressed or responded to. It's not unlike the sort of missed milestones that Sirine was talking about. And as an example of the lasting effects of NCIRS, even after the program went away, it was possible, and Denyse and I, triaged on some of these cases where somebody might years later, fall in love with the US citizen, get married, and be in a green card interview at a local immigration office, only to be told that they were going to be denied their green card because they failed for the now defunct NCIRS program many years prior. And who knows if they even knew about it, right? Because not every teenager reads the Federal Register, right, on a regular basis. So that just gives you a sort of pinned example of the lasting effects. And we've actually only been talking about policies that are explicitly targeting people based on their nationality or their race, like CARP or NCIRS or the Muslim ban. But also to add to the landscape, as Sirine nicely put it, there are several neutral immigration policies that have a disproportionate impact on specific individuals and communities based on nationality and race. So in that sense, it's a pretty overwhelming dilemma if we're going to actually grapple with how our immigration law and policy targets people based on where they're from or the color of their skin.
Just to add to that, in terms of let's use the asylum process as an example. It's been fairly typical for apply to Arabs and Muslims, not to have just one interview, but to be called back for 2 interviews or 3 interviews. And basically you can always tell where they're headed because of the fact that the focus is terrorism. And, here's an example. Clients owned gas stations. He wasn't working in the gas stations, but he owned gas stations in Syria. So what happened to him was that, he went, they initially interviewed him, then they called him back because they wanted to hear more about who were the clients, who did you pump gas for, what, and they asked for identification. And you say to the officer, he didn't pump the gas. He owned the gas station. He wasn't involved. Come back for a 3rd interview, same types of things. And it's really focused like that, like they are looking for ways to say, look, you provided material support for terrorism, even if you didn't know it, and even if nobody could prove it, that's where they're headed on these types of interviews, and that was for asylum, but it also happens in other contexts. So it's still happening today.
Absolutely right. One question that came in, it's asking about the rhetoric by, politicians and the weaponizing of immigration, and how did the rhetoric impede on any immigration reform or any advancements on immigration? Were politicians following the lead of the mob, or was it the other way around? I guess is what the question's asking.
If I'm following the question, it's an important historical point that days before 9/11 was the handshake, right, between former President Bush and the president of Mexico, right? And they both made a handshake committing to get immigration reform done. So that was what the picture looked like in the very beginning of September 2001. And then 9/11 happened, right? And from then we moved from a framework or commitment to reform immigration, which, by the way, has not been reformed legislatively since 1990, to a conflation of immigration and terrorism, or immigrants as terrorism. It was the sort of volatility and rhetoric around border security and terrorism that led to the abolishment of the old agency INS and the creation of this Department of Homeland Security. None of this is to dismiss the tragedy of what happened on 9/11 or the behavior of those who perpetrated the attack, but to use that then to label everyone, right, who is entering the United States from a particular part of the world, as a future terrorist is problematic. So, what I saw, and this is before I was at Penn State and working in DC at the time on these very issues, there was a lot of resistance from policymakers and legislators to look soft on security, right? And part of that meant not supporting rollbacks to post 9/11, but rather supporting any kind of policy that was in the name of national security, whether or not it materialized into actually protecting national security.
The other thing is, I think that there are people on the Hill that would like to have immigration reform. It's not to say that nobody wants immigration reform, but I think you can't divorce this from the work of Stephen Miller with regard to the portrait of immigrants and how immigrants are pretty much responsible for every ill in society. And you're hearing it today. You're still hearing that today. And I think that, at this point, this whole kind of hatred of immigrants, and fear comes from like the Tantan Network. And I think it's important to call it out. It's like, this is for the Federation for American Immigration Reform. This is the Center for Immigration Studies. This is Americans for Immigration Control. They're all part of this same group that basically the focus is zero immigration. We don't need immigrants, we have enough. And the Tantan, John Tantan was the founder of these organizations, who also received funding from the Pioneer Fund, which was involved with eugenics. And so you cannot divorce, I think, where these organizations are and how they're quoted, and without recognizing that this is where they come from. And I think it's important for advocates to try to illuminate that, so that they are not given credibility on these issues, because congressmen and senators quote them. They use their materials. And I think that's also part of how, and Stephen Miller was a part of that. And so were several others in the prior administration.
I mean, I guess maybe picking up on this last point that Denyse is making, I think it's really important to acknowledge and understand that, like, the history of immigration laws in the US is a history of racism and discrimination and white supremacy. Like, it's not really a question of like making some reforms around the edges or I think that in every successive change to the immigration laws, even where some things have gotten better, like less quotas or not naming specific countries out of which you're not going to let people come in, that same orientation still exists. Like, they are still laws that are fundamentally based on a racist premise, and they are still laws that are fundamentally based on, white supremacist tenets. And I think Miller and Tantan and like that whole sort of like lineage is actually finds like a good home for itself in the immigration context. And that's why I think that when we think about immigration reform and change, we really should be thinking about ways to fundamentally transform the system and to fundamentally transform the agencies, so that they're really not perpetuating these same racist tropes about different communities, or these same kind of exclusionary things that make it so that anytime that anyone has contact with the criminal legal system, for example, that's somehow a complete exclusion of your ability to participate in this country, regardless of, the kind of overall social surroundings that make it so that people are more likely to have contact with the criminal legal system if they come from certain communities, to kind of all these post 9/11 measures, and to all of that. I think, to me, it's really important to kind of think of all that stuff as being of a piece, and to think about our demands for immigration reform in that context of like really asking for a transformation of the system and a transformation of the way that we think about welcoming people and, living in this country and what that means, as opposed to just kind of, fixing the worst ills of the system.
Thank you. A couple questions came in, one through the chat and one on Facebook related to Afghanistan. I think it's timely to, address them with everything that's happening. And since we are talking about 9/11, there is that, of course, the direct link with the war that was started. But what are the question is, we hear often in the media now about SIVs. What are SIVs? And tying that into another question, what are the options for Afghan nationals that are coming into the US? How should this country proceed with this crisis?
I mean, I can get us started for a minute and then hand it over to Denyse. I mean, we're in the middle of an emergency, right? And so many of the options that exist under law, first depend on people being able to physically and safely leave their homes and get to a place where they can actually travel. And for many people, that includes the airport or a third country. Some of the options under immigration law include refugee resettlement, but that's a very long process, as is the special immigrant visa process, which is limited to certain Afghan nationals who helped the US government or worked on specific US projects. There's another remedy in immigration law called humanitarian parole. And this is authority that the agency has to allow for the entry of people during an emergency, simply put. And I think this actually connects to Sirine's point about what transformation looks like. You know, I think when we hear about reform, we absolutely have to think about Congress and what legislative reform looks like. But there is an incredible amount of power that the executive branch has, right? And so how it uses that power, both in emergencies as well as in immigration policy generally, right? It has the discretion to choose not to detain and deport certain people, just like it has the discretion to parole Afghan nationals who are in danger. So I think we really have to think about executive power and discretion, and include that in the conversation of what change and transformation looks like.
And there's a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot of lawyers right now are involved in working with either trying to do special immigrant visas, working on humanitarian paroles. I mean, all of this is just being stood up like in the last week or two because it's just happened. And so if there's organizations, and Sirine, I don't know what the project is doing. I'm sure the project has got a lot going on there. So I would look forward to hearing what you have to say. But I know that the American Immigration Lawyers Association just had a conference call with about 650 lawyers on it. And there's a lot of other groups out there that are doing work on behalf of the Afghan refugees. But as Shoba said, it's an emergency and people need to get to a safe place. And that's one of the biggest issues right now, is getting them to a safe place. Unfortunately, we don't have that capacity. I mean, we're not in that space where we can help that, but we can help in other ways. Sirine, why don't you talk about the project? I'm sure you all have something going on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's happened so quickly and so massively. And I think we've kind of also been trying to understand where the gaps are to figure out where we can fill in. Because as you say, I mean, I think it's an emergency, and some of the organizations that have presences on the ground, for example, or had presences on the ground in Afghanistan and now have, like, you know, a closer tie, like the International Refugee Assistance Project and HIAS and like all of those other groups are kind of trying to corral, and we are kind of thinking about how to activate our membership to plug those holes that have not been plugged by others. I think one thing that's becoming more and more apparent is that it's going to be almost impossible to get everyone out of Afghanistan who needs to get out of Afghanistan. And so I think there's also some brainstorming that's been happening about like how do people find safety in country if they can't leave. And, you know, I think, but in the immediate, what we're doing is we're kind of pushing out calls for assistance. We're trying to work closely and be in touch with groups like IRAP and HIAS who are kind of triaging there. And then also talking to some other groups about where to send lawyers. Like, because I think also the issue becomes that everyone's getting outreaches and it's very hard to sort of like not duplicate work and make sure that the resources are being used in the best way possible. So our path so far has been that we've been sort of attending some of those calls that AILA is putting out and talking to IRAP and others and trying to figure out like where we can best plug in. And so again, like I think to the extent that, you know, ADC or others have work on this or ongoing things that you think we can, you know, that you think it would be useful to activate networks of lawyers to be working on, we're definitely all in to support. And then there's also kind of a separate question about like what kind of resources and support are going to be needed at the airport. And Dulles Airport is definitely going to be a hub for people coming in. And so we're spending some time thinking about that as well.
And look, I'll add, I mean, you know, Sirine, you mentioned the word resources. I think that's the biggest challenge, at least for ADC in the past few years, and for other, you know, organizations working on immigration, is resources. And I'm not talking in the terms of financial, but manpower and, you know, volunteer attorneys going out there, and those that have volunteered are burnt out because of all the challenges that we're seeing. So if there's any lawyers, new young lawyers watching this that want to volunteer, drop your name in the or email in the chat box or on the Facebook, and we'll pass it along to Sirine as well, and we'll share it to ADC and put you and get you plugged in. one of the things, and ties into a question that came up, is, people often overlook how much damage was really done to the system over the past 4 years, let alone the past 20 years. But what kind of effort is going to take, and Sirine, you touched on it a little bit about, what needs to be done, but what kind of effort is going to take to walk back some of these policies beyond just, rescinding an executive order? And so for what kind of effort is going to take from the community, what from the government and legislative side as well?
I mean, I guess one thing that we maybe didn't spend as much time talking about, but which is extremely relevant, is the impact of all this stuff on refugee processing. Like refugee processing, especially for Iraqis, Afghanis, people over the past several years has been really, really difficult. And after the Muslim ban obviously became even more intensely so. And so I actually think that we need to also be looking ahead to what happens after the first wave of evacuations, because there's going to be like a massive increase in people fleeing and kind of trying to get to a third country and then resettle in the United States. And so that's another, sorry, that's not directly responsive to your question, Abed, but it's something that actually I was realizing as you were talking, like, you know what? I mean, all of those post 9/11 policies are partly responsible for how difficult it is to get processed as a refugee. So that's one piece. But as far as like how to get all that stuff done, I mean, I think it's partly like, this is largely a political fight, like the courts are there and we litigate and, try to do what we can there. But ultimately, these things are not going to get resolved like fundamentally in the courts, like maybe in case by case, or maybe certain things you can sort of address that way. And, the administration is going to do what it's going to do. And there are some like avenues for administrative advocacy that I think a lot of our groups, including ADC, are kind of using for specific purposes. But to me, like the big push that really needs to happen is more of an organizing push, like to get everyone aligned that these narratives are really destructive and that they play out in policies that need to really be changed. Because to the extent that the messaging to the administration, for example, or to Congress is like, oh, you just need to fix this problem that is like, more of a technical problem or something like that. Like, I just think that's never going to get us to the solution that we need. And so I feel like what we really need is for all of our communities and all of our groups and all of our networks and contacts to kind of be activating a more organizing and advocacy approach to addressing these problems, like to try to really express a will of the community and the people and voters to see meaningful change. Because otherwise, I really think we're just stuck in a loop where like sometimes things are a little better, sometimes they're a little worse, but we're still kind of operating within the same broad framework.
And just to build on that, and I have it right here, with me all the time. Here's our immigration statute, right? It's been compared second in complication to the US tax code. And I do want to go back to legislative reform because it hasn't changed fundamentally since 1990. You compare or analyze any other system, right? And imagine, what the fallout or consequences would be if there were no changes or 2.0 or modernization in over 3 decades. And what you would be looking at are, more than just 1 or 2 cracks. So that on top of all of the policies that we've already been discussing is what our immigration system looks like today. And there are broad reforms that could be enacted legislatively. And it too is also more about the politics than about, the minds failing to come together and come up with a good policy proposal, right? There has to be enough political will to push it through the finish line. And until that happens, we are at least legislatively going to be in this space where we're picking off the pieces that we think might have the chance of passing. But I'm going to end by going back to the executive branch, right? Because there are still significant changes that the executive branch can make. They could just not repeal the ban, but also have a solution for anyone who has been affected as a result of the ban, whether it be paroling people into the United States or providing individuals with a type of prosecutorial discretion. So there's a lot of flexibility that the government has to relax rules, policies, and procedures. And there are ways to do that in ways that are consequential and that help more than just 1 or 2 people.
I think Shoba makes a very good point in that regard, but with regard to the executive branch and what they can do, but going back to the political will to do it, it's like, what is it going to take for the political will to accomplish that? And I think that the more that people are in contact with their senators, their congressmen, writing to the government, I mean, it's like when congressmen and senators get like a couple hundred letters, regular letters, that's a lot for them. We don't seem to think that that's that important. But if they are then inundated with information or questions or letters about, look, this is really important to us. We're your constituents. We want this to happen. It does make a difference. I mean, it made so much of a difference that in 2007, they trashed the bill. There was a bill that looked like it was going to be passed in 2007, but the Republicans shut down basically the switchboard, the White House switchboard, because they had so many people call in. So I really want people to recognize that, you know, this participatory democracy actually does work. And we can make this change. We just have to be, I think, in this regard, most recently, more organized about it. Right now, with regard to the budget bill, there's like, and also for reconciliation, there are immigration provisions in that bill, or there will be, because there's talk about it. And I think this is a matter of really like one thing that maybe ADC can do in terms of putting out the word to say, here are things you can do, and here are some issues we want you to talk about, so that maybe at least now, because this is going to happen, I mean, whether it happens or not, it's going to happen soon. And I think that this is something at least we could try to get some change on. I know immigrants list, we put out a list of just 7 things that we think would be really helpful in terms of immigration reform. It's not as broad reaching, but it would affect a huge number of people. It might not sound that sexy, but it would affect a large number of people. So those are some things I think we could take action on.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of, text messages from friends, and look, it's like, why didn't you mention 287G? Listen, there's a lot of issues we didn't get to touch on. 287G, the attack on H-1B visas, the TPS issues, the, DACA and how that impacts the community. I mean, we could talk for hours, so I'm sorry to any of our friends out there if we really didn't dive into these issues. You're right, the entire enforcement apparatus and ICE and the southern border and family separation issues. We could talk for hours, and maybe we'll make a series out of this because that bill is coming up. So I apologize really if we did not dive into those. There are resources out there which we will share. I know Shoba has a couple great books out there. One of them is Banned Immigration Enforcement in the Time of Trump. And another one which has very useful information is Beyond Deportation, the Role of Prosecutorial Discretion in Immigration Cases. And I really emphasize those 2 books have some amazing information if you want to learn more. And we will share other resources, Sirine, if you send them, and Denyse, if you have them. We are following the budget bills that's coming forward, and ADC will be pushing on those. But I just want to give each of you, something to say in closing, whatever's on your mind about this, or whatever last message you want to put out there on this topic. So Shoba, if you want to.
Yeah, my last message is, this was a lot of information we covered despite having not covered it all. And I hope the takeaway message is to not be tired, because it is so easy for nothing to change. And the only way change really does happen, whether it be a small, medium, or large scale, is to press, is to keep pressing. So take one thing from this conversation, become educated about it, figure out what group or groups to plug into, to be part of a larger action. That's my last word.
Thank you. Denyse?
Yeah, to echo that, it would be, especially with regard to anyone that has cases pending that feel like they're, just giving up hope, don't. There are mechanisms that we can use to try to push your case along, that and it is important, even if you don't get a great response from your congressperson or your senator, to put them in the loop, to let them know this is what's going on, because the more letters, the more help they're asked for. They keep this information. They have statistics, and right now they know that their stats are up, that they need help with immigration issues. And the more that they know about it, and the more educated they are about it, the more help we're going to get when we need to get legislation.
And Sirine?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I really agree with everything that's been said already. And I would just kind of add to that, like wherever we can find a piece of low-hanging fruit that we can tackle and push for, we should just go for it. Like if these things don't happen under this particular landscape, it's hard to see when they're ever going to happen. But, I think more broadly, I just would kind of reiterate, I think what I started with, which is that I think the immigration system is one that should be looked at holistically, and that the Arab community, the Muslim community, and other communities are kind of allied in this fight against the racism of the enforcement apparatus, including 287G and the detention and enforcement system that Abed alluded to a moment ago. So to me, as long as we see these fights as intersected and parts of like the same overall racial justice fight, I think we can sort of also have a long view towards really transforming the system, and then in the short term, just push for whatever low-hanging fruit pieces we can push for without undermining kind of the broader message of the transformations that really need to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. So, in closing, I want to encourage you, if you're not signed up to ADC's email list, please go to adc.org, sign up, support, and check out the information for our upcoming conference in LA in October 8th and 9th in California, the West Coast Conference. And we also will be sending out resource material on this topic as well. I want to thank the speakers, not just for appearing today, but for your commitment throughout your career. You've served as allies, you've served as partners, as friends, and folks that really got us through some difficult times, not just in the past 4 years, but over the past 20 years. And for that, we appreciate your work, and we look forward to continuing this fight with you. And thank you, for joining us and for everything that you have done for us. It's appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Abed. Thanks, Denyse and Shoba. Bye.